喺呢一場疫苗戰爭當中，危害最深嘅兩種疫苗，必定係 mRNA 疫苗同含水銀嘅疫苗。過去嘅主日已經提及 mRNA 疫苗影響人體嘅蛋白質，導致各種致命嘅變異現象。而水銀則係一種根本唔存在安全劑量嘅有毒物質，哪怕係一丁點都唔應該被注射到人體內。2025年8月5日，小羅拔甘迺迪於衛生部官網上傳咗一段演講，詳細講解佢全面禁止疫苗當中含有水銀成分嘅決定。明顯，小羅拔甘迺迪完全清楚知道疫苗嘅禍害，並且決心一步步終結疫苗對美國人嘅影響。以下係影片內容。
Hi, I'm Robert F. Kennedy, Jr., your HHS Secretary. I'm happy to report that last week we closed the final chapter in the long history of thimerosal in the United States. Thimerosal, of course, is a mercury-based vaccine preservative. Its main component, ethyl mercury, is a known and very potent neurotoxin. Until we withdrew the recommendation last week, flu shots containing thimerosal, astonishingly, were still being administered to millions of Americans, including pregnant women and children. Now, I've taken a lot of flack from the vaccine industry and from its allies in the press about my decision to ban it. So I want to talk a little bit about my reasons. In early 2001, the director of the FDA Office of Vaccine Research and Review, the late William Egan, admitted under oath before Congress that thimerosal's safety had never been studied in human beings. Further, CDC has no existing guidelines for safe exposures to ethyl mercury. It is therefore inexcusable that these agencies allowed neurotoxic mercury to be injected into Americans for so long. A quick search of the National Library of Medicine's PubMed and PubChem websites nets thousands of studies on search terms such as mercury neurotoxicity, mercury in development, and mercury in the brain. Hundreds of them identify thimerosal as a potent neurotoxin, a carcinogen, a mutagen, and an endocrine disruptor. But let's put all that peer-reviewed science aside and just look at what the government itself and the vaccine industry say about thimerosal. Thimerosal's own label advises against its use during pregnancy, pointing out that thimerosal has never been shown to be safe and that it causes mutations in mammals. Thimerosal's material safety data sheet acknowledges that thimerosal is toxic, that it has nervous system and reproductive effects, that it's mutagenic in mammalian cells, that exposure to mercury and thimerosal in utero and in children could cause mild to severe mental retardation and mild to severe motor coordination impairment. The MSDS also lists a grim inventory of dozens of other devastating injuries from thimerosal exposure.
冇錯，喺呢一度，小羅拔甘迺迪清楚提到一個可怕嘅現象。一方面，標籤上明確說明含水銀嘅疫苗唔建議孕婦使用，因為其毒性嚴重影響神經同生殖系統，甚至導致哺乳類動物嘅細胞突變。若果胎兒或係嬰幼兒接觸到流瘤孔當中嘅水銀，可能會引發輕至重度嘅智力遲緩以及運動協調障礙。呢啲危害喺標籤上面早已明確說明，更加唔使提其他大量研究，加以證實水銀對人體嘅毒性毋庸置疑。然而，令人震驚嘅係，美國政府卻同時批准藥廠合法生產並廣泛向美國人接種含水銀嘅流感疫苗，接種對象甚至包括孕婦同嬰兒。呢個唔單止等同直接承認疫苗嘅禍害，亦都驗證咗幾十年前日華牧師嘅前瞻性警告，提醒弟兄姊妹唔好接種疫苗或係流感針。過去好多人可能難以接受咁樣嘅概念，嗰啲本應為咗救助生命、改善健康嘅藥廠、科學家、醫生同醫療系統，無論點樣追求利益，亦都不至於喪心病狂到以毒害他人嘅方式賺錢，讓孕婦誕下先天有缺陷嘅胎兒，或係讓嬰幼兒嘅神經系統受損，從小就智力遲緩、運動障礙。但小羅拔甘迺迪嘅解說正係揭示咗真相，佢哋的確係如此嘅唯利是圖，甚至到咗喪心病狂嘅地步。試諗下，一個貪婪嘅汽車維修店老闆，為咗獲得更多補胎嘅生意，故意喺道路上撒釘子， 導致汽車爆胎，以此謀取維修費用。呢一種行為明顯違法，最終會面對牢獄之災。然而，藥廠同西醫界卻係利用龐大嘅金錢網絡壟斷科學研究，控制醫學院，並滲透到政府官僚體系。即使有無可辯駁嘅客觀證據證明水銀有害，仍然有人為咗利益埋沒良心，繼續批准呢啲害人嘅疫苗。呢啲疫苗唔單止被合法生產，甚至完全避開法律嘅制裁，不斷向數百萬、數千萬美國人注射，每年從西醫、診所同醫院提供源源不絕嘅顧客。嗰啲從孕婦同嬰兒時期就被注射毒疫苗嘅人，往往從幾個月大嘅時候就已經成為醫療系統嘅永久顧客。而每一個顧客背後，唔單止係呢一個嬰兒嘅一生被徹底毀掉，連帶佢嘅父母、兄弟姊妹乃至整個家庭嘅未來都被摧毀。而整個悲劇嘅根源，正係人類嘅貪婪、不擇手段同損人利己嘅本性。就正如聖經所講，貪財是萬惡之根。而家讓我哋接續2025年8月5日小羅伯甘迺迪嘅演講內容。
In 2001, the National Institute for Environmental Health Sciences warned that thimerosal is toxic by ingestion and inhalation. The California EPA recognizes thimerosal as a reproductive toxin in the clearest possible language. Thimerosal, it says, dissociates in the body to ethylmercury. The evidence for its reproductive toxicity includes severe mental retardation or malformations in human offspring who were poisoned when their mothers were exposed to ethylmercury or received thimerosal vaccines while pregnant. Studies in animals demonstrate that developmental toxicity after exposure to either ethylmercury or thimerosal. The U.S. EPA also identifies mercury and mercury compounds as causing reproductive toxicity. The amount of ethylmercury in the flu shot that CDC just banned under my order is 25,000 times the EPA's safety level for drinking water. Federal and state laws provide that whenever expired thimerosal vaccines are disposed of, they constitute hazardous waste. They have to be disposed of in special landfills. I have to ask again, why were we injecting this toxin into babies and pregnant women? A year 2000 study by the National Research Council found that prenatal and infant mercury exposures cause multiple impacts to basic brain development by disrupting the division and the migration of neuronal cells. According to the National Toxicity Program, ethylmercury is a neurotoxin. Infants may be more susceptible than adults. Ethylmercury exposure from vaccines probably caused neurotoxic responses in some children. A 2005 NIH study commissioned by FDA's Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research and performed by the National Toxicity Program found that ethylmercury in thimerosal crosses the blood-brain barrier, lodges in the brain, and metabolizes into the most toxic form of mercury at double the rate of the heavily regulated methylmercury in fish. A subsequent study found that this highly toxic mercury remains in the brain for over 27 years. A 2017 study by CDC links miscarriage to flu vaccines and found that the odds of having a miscarriage within 28 days were 7.7 times greater than in women who did not receive a flu shot during pregnancy. Another study published that same year in the Journal of the American Medical Association found an elevated risk of autism spectrum disorders in children whose mothers had received a first trimester flu shot. Instead of immediately withdrawing thimerosal from flu shots to protect women and their babies, CDC issued a gag order instructing its personnel not to discuss that study. On October 1st, 2001, the Institute of Medicine of the National Academy of Sciences issued a report concluding that the link between thimerosal and the rise of neurological injuries in American children, including autism, is, quote, biologically plausible, end quote. And they recommended the termination of all thimerosal preserved vaccines. Regulators should never have allowed mercury in any vaccine, especially those given to children. They had the science, but they chose to ignore it. For 20 years, I've been battling to get mercury out of vaccines. Instead of following the science, CDC and its allies in the industry and the pharma-funded media have marginalized, vilified, and censored parents, doctors, and scientists who question the wisdom of using mercury in vaccines by calling them by the pejorative anti-vaxxer. I've been trying to get mercury out of fish for 40 years, and nobody called me anti-fish. That's the pattern we've seen for too long. Companies protect profits by suppressing the science, and regulators lie to the public and look the other way.
於呢一度，小羅伯甘迺迪繼續揭露西醫界嘅手段，佢哋運用銀彈策略，唔單止收買並控制科學家同政府，仲進一步操控傳媒同輿論，透過扣帽子嘅方式，將反對疫苗嘅人貶稱為反疫苗者，試圖抹黑佢哋嘅聲譽，將黑講成白，將白講成黑，指責佢哋係壞人，喺度阻礙別人得到疫苗嘅保護。喺社會上，反疫苗者不斷被打壓，就好似石安被打壓一樣，甚至佢哋仲被標籤為懷疑政府、腦袋有問題嘅陰謀論者，以此孤立同埋消滅佢哋嘅聲音。然而，時至今日，呢啲曾經被視為天方夜譚嘅醫學陰謀，卻一一被證實，完全應驗箴言22章3節，通達人見禍躲藏，愚蒙人前往受害。而家，讓我哋接續2025年8月5日小羅伯甘迺迪嘅演講內容。
But this pattern ends now under President Trump's new HHS. I'm happy to announce that my newly appointed CDC Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices voted in June to recommend a full ban on mercury-containing preservatives in all vaccines, including flu shots. I formally approved that recommendation last week. The decision breaks decades of paralysis, and it fulfills the 1999 promise by the National Academy of Sciences. And it finally aligns U.S. vaccine policy with that of developed countries that removed mercury additives decades ago. Let me be clear, flu vaccines will remain available. Manufacturers have confirmed that they can shift from mercury-preserved multi-dose vials to single-dose applications, and this change ensures the uninterrupted supply for both the Vaccines for Children program and adult vaccination efforts. Now that the U.S. has removed mercury from all vaccines, we urge global health authorities to follow suit for the protection of children around the world. We urge the World Health Organization and Gavi to stop their programs of injecting mercury into more than 100 million black and brown babies in developing countries annually. This moment marks a major step toward restoring public trust in the safety of our medicines. This decision sends a clear message. The days of ignoring the science are over. The days of putting profits ahead of people are over. We are remaking FDA and CDC under President Trump's leadership, your FDA and your CDC, into the vigilant public watchdogs that they were always meant to be. Thank you.
一日之後，2025年8月6日，小羅伯甘迺迪宣布取消5億美元嘅 mRNA 疫苗研發基金，並停止22項 mRNA 疫苗研究。
Hi, it's Robert F. Kennedy Jr. here, your HHS secretary. At HHS, we have a division called the Biomedical Advanced Research and Development Authority, or BARDA. BARDA drives some of our most advanced scientific research. It funds developments of vaccines, drugs, diagnostics, and other tools to fight emerging diseases and national health threats. Over the past few weeks, BARDA reviewed 22 mRNA vaccine development investments and began canceling them. Let me explain why. Most of these shots are for flu or COVID, but as the pandemic showed us, mRNA vaccines don't perform well against viruses that infect the upper respiratory tract. Here's the problem. mRNA only codes for a small part of the viral proteins, usually a single antigen. One mutation and the vaccine becomes ineffective. This dynamic drives a phenomenon called antigenic shift, meaning that the vaccine paradoxically encourages new mutations and can actually prolong pandemics as the virus constantly mutates to escape the protective effects of the vaccine. millions of people, maybe even you or someone you know, caught the Omicron variant despite being vaccinated. That's because a single mutation can make mRNA vaccines ineffective. The same risk applies to flu.
於呢一度，小羅伯甘迺迪提出一個嶄新嘅論點 ：mRNA 疫苗正係延長新冠疫情嘅原因之一。由於 mRNA 疫苗嘅本質會促使病毒不斷突變，呢個唔單止讓所有現存嘅疫苗失去效用，仲會導致接種者因病毒突變而再次感染另一種新型嘅變異株。隨住接種 mRNA 疫苗嘅人數越多，新嘅變異株就會不斷湧現，感染亦隨之持續蔓延。藥廠利用呢種情況，不斷推出針對新變異株設計嘅疫苗。然而，呢啲新疫苗進入人體之後，反而再次促使病毒突變，產生另一波變異株，形成一個無止境嘅惡性循環。因此，新冠疫情被不斷延長，成為一場看似無法終結嘅危機。即使到咗今日，政府仍然鼓勵人們接種針對不同病毒株嘅疫苗。而家，讓我哋接續2025年8月5日小羅伯甘迺迪嘅演講內容。
After reviewing the science and consulting top experts at NIH and FDA, HHS has determined that mRNA technology poses more risk than benefits for these respiratory viruses. That's why, after extensive review, BARDA has begun the process of terminating these 22 contracts totaling just under $500 million. To replace the troubled mRNA programs, we're prioritizing the development of safer, broader vaccine strategies, like whole virus vaccines and novel platforms that don't collapse when viruses mutate. Let me be absolutely clear. HHS supports safe, effective vaccines for every American who wants them. That's why we're moving beyond the limitations of mRNA for respiratory viruses and investing in better solutions. Thank you.